before we talk about pregnancy, where are we then with regard to recommendations with hormone replacement therapy?
So I would say that the biggest thing that we have learned in the last decade or so is that there's this window of opportunity for when you can initiate hormone replacement therapy. So in the original Women's Health Initiative study, they provided postmenopausal women who are 65 and older various forms of hormone replacement therapy, and they didn't find much of a benefit. But now what we have done is see, okay, well, actually, when those hormones are declining in this sort of nonlinear fashion, in those key perimenopausal years, that's when we can start to see this improvement, perhaps, with hormone replacement therapy. And it depends on, the dose and the duration and the formulation that you use is going to have, person-specific recommendations, but we should be doing it during a time in which hormones are in flux and they're not necessarily completely offline.
So how did all this research then lead you to start focusing on pregnancy?
I was noticing that even how we study the menstrual cycle is really inconsistent. And, we have a 28-day menstrual cycle. There's fluctuations in estrogen and progesterone, and those can influence the brain, cognition, and mood. But our typical approach to studying women across the cycle is to bring them in at one or two time points, say during menstruation, maybe try to track them and get them during ovulation, which is very hard to do, and try to study, what does the brain look like in a high estrogen state versus low estrogen state. But this, the central feature of the menstrual cycle is, and reproductive life, is this cyclical variation, this rhythm of hormones every month. And that is what's really important. You're trying to apply a static sampling rate to a dynamical system. And in fact, those changes in those hormones are what are initiating a lot of the things we can pick up on. And so I was kind of taken with that and the literature saying, yes, the menstrual cycle is important, or no, it's pretty split. And simultaneously, we were seeing this big new trend in neuroscience of precision imaging or dense sampling, where a few researchers at a few different groups were kind of flipping that cross-sectional model, where we started to study fewer number of individuals over longer periods of time, rather than taking 100 people and scanning their brain one time and correlating some sleep metric to the brain. It was studying maybe 5 individuals 20 to 30 times, and I thought, this is a great way to study the cycle. So I volunteered myself a summer of grad school, happy to be a guinea pig, and I scanned my brain and we took my blood for 30 days straight across a complete reproductive cycle. Just begin asking that question of how do those day-to-day changes in hormones relate to day-to-day changes in the brain. And then I did it again on a birth control pill as a way to kind of modify my hormonal milieu in a ethical way, and compare and contrast those. And you can see that this is, leading up to our pregnancy study. It's a similar sort of design. But we gleaned really interesting things there. I could predict the connectivity of my brain based on my estrogen levels. We could use time-locked models to predict, what my brain looked like at ovulation. We saw structural changes in response to that bimodal shift in progesterone that went away when I, basically shut progesterone down on my birth control pill. And it was just fun data. We put it open. We uploaded it to the internet. People can play with that data. It obviously needs to be reproduced, but it's kind of the first of its kind data set of really high spatial temporal resolution.
Fascinating. I mean, that's really interesting. Let me ask you just a couple of basic questions. What was the control group here then? I mean, was it men? I mean, how do you know that this isn't just something that happens?
Yeah, that's a great question. So at the time, we didn't have a control group. It was myself comparing, my low levels of hormones to my high levels of hormones. And then ultimately, the follow-up study where then I took one of the hormones offline and could compare and contrast was sort of that internal control. However, I then recruited my now husband, not at the time, to do a similar sort of study because, males have estrogen, they have testosterone, they're influenced by their cycles too. It's just a different diurnal rhythm. And so we actually then scanned his brain over 30 days at 7 a.m. and 8 p.m. He loved his life. He was very happy to do it. And we were able to see, how his fluctuations in hormones, testosterone, I think he was in his mid-20s at the time, declined by 70% within a day. And we looked at his estrogen levels, his cortisol levels. And then we were able to compare also, a different graduate student in the lab compared the relationship between brain connectivity and hormones that we saw in me to him. And we saw similar patterns. They play a specific role in both sexes. They're important in both sexes. And we've been having fun comparing and contrasting there.
By the way, what a study, huh? So MRIs at 7 a.m. and 8 p.m. and lots of blood draws. No wonder you guys got married. That's a lot of sacrifice you made for your study.
Yes, he was a champion for it. And you know, we also at the same time did a lot of surveys of ourselves. So we really got to know ourselves. You know, you have to track mood and sleep and diet and all of that. It's an interesting, unique type of study, and it's not the end all be all, but it's quite the design. We have a lot of data.
So let me focus on pregnancy for a second. So you led the first longitudinal study tracking brain changes throughout pregnancy. I think you've just given us an idea of how you did this, involving MRI scanning, blood testing. Was there a specific question that you were trying to answer, or were you just trying to establish that there was variations that occurred throughout that time period?
Yeah, it's sort of both in this, because it was so unexplored, those questions sort of blurred together. And so, you know, over the last decade, using brain imaging techniques in partnership with all of the amazing preclinical work that's going on in non-human species, we've begun shedding light on how the brain reorganizes in response to pregnancy. It's a transformative period in a person's life. It's tied to hormonal change, social change, environmental change. And what we've done thus far is kind of these snapshot approaches of how the brain looks pre-conception to women and maybe 2 to 3 months out of postpartum. This is work led by Dr. Susanna Carmona and Dr. Elseline Hexema in Europe, who have done beautiful work to showcase that there's these significant and persistent reductions in gray matter volume and cortical thickness from prepartum to postpartum. And, you know, we see like the flattening of the cortex, we see these reductions that don't go back to baseline in postpartum. But what changes happen during gestation itself? If there's this sort of 3 to 5% decrease in total gray matter volume, when is that occurring and how is it occurring? We're missing huge gaps in what we call this sort of metamorphosis. We know that the 40-week gestational window leads to these, you know, body adaptations. There's to support the development of the fetus. We have increased plasma volume, immune function change, metabolic rate, oxygen consumption, but we don't know what that looks like. So the question sort of was, what does this trajectory look like over gestation? And it was also the sort of proof of concept to say stuff is changing and we need to study this at length. And so that's what we sort of sought to do, just starting with one person. And I can, you know, later go into how this study has expanded into larger numbers of people. But yeah, that was sort of what we did, this intensive longitudinal design over a single individual who was scanned preconception, during IVF, along all 3 trimesters into 2 years postpartum.
And you noticed objective changes in the brain, gray matter thickening or thinning, did you say?
So our findings, which looked at a woman's brain peri, postpartum, found that as women advance through their gestational weeks, 0 to 40 weeks, we saw this reduction in gray matter volume pretty much across the whole brain. That was also shown if you look at cortical thinning. We saw increased white matter microstructure and ventricle size, and all of that sort of, you know, the inflection point was birth, and we saw that those reductions persisted into postpartum with slight recovery, meaning that certain areas of the brain showed this rise in gray matter volume in the early postpartum, others did not. But it showcases this choreographed dance between major features of our brain that are changing over pregnancy itself, which in theory can underlie this sort of preparation for the next stage, which is parenting, caregiving, motherhood.
And how far out did you then follow? So in this one patient, at least, even during the IVF cycle, during pregnancy, and then postpartum, you said maybe there was some recovery back to sort of pre-pregnancy brain structures. How far out did you look?
We studied her up until 2 years postpartum. We studied her and scanned her brain a lot more in the early postpartum. So we have, you know, a fewer data points out, you know, 1 to 2 years out. But you can look at that trend and you see there's a little bit of partial volume recovery, but it never really goes back to baseline for the gray matter volume. In addition, in the other work that's been done in the sort of more snapshot approaches, they've followed the sub cohort of those women up to 6 years and saw that reduction persisted. There's some normalization, but it's I would argue it's a permanent etching. And, we can go even further. Not the people that we studied during pregnancy, but if we take these sort of midlife or older age cohorts of people, like using the UK Biobank data, which is this huge population cohort in the UK of, thousands of people, you can try to look at, features of the brain, whether it's structure or function, and model it by how many pregnancies someone had and see that, you can see differences there. The more pregnancies someone had, the younger looking brain they had, or they had a more protected connectome versus, the typical aging effects we see in aging or as we get older. So it's all of that together suggests that there is this foundational change that occurs during pregnancy that stays with us. And we can get into the sort of like the cognitive trends there, but this is a critical period of brain development and brain plasticity that I don't think we really would have called it that, a decade ago.
It's interesting because, as you point out, if people who are listening can just imagine the brain, and people think of brain as gray matter, but it's gray matter and white matter. You have gray matter sort of on the outside. You have these white matter tracks. Deep within the brain, you may have gray matter, what are called nuclei, so these sort of very important areas deep in the center of the brain. You are describing a picture where gray matter sort of shrinks, more so sounds like around the edge, the cortex, as it's called. But when that happens, if the volume stays the same, some of those white matter tracks may expand a bit. Some of the natural fluid-filled spaces within the brain may expand a bit to maintain that overall volume. That's the picture you've described as what happens during pregnancy in the brain. Again, not to oversimplify, but is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, so when you hear shrink or like a reduction of volume, right? Most people are going to say, oh, that's not good. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I've learned anything from talking to people about this paper is, oh yeah, like I could have told you that. My brain is shrinking. But in reality, there's likely two things that are going on. One is there's this physiological adaptation to pregnancy itself. So there is going to be some swelling, some cortical pressure, there's increased blood flow, all of that. And our brain, just like our placenta, our belly, our feet, all of that is going to be adjusting to meet those demands. Some things will go, back to baseline when you are, you don't have that fluid retention. The other thing is, and this is based on evidence of not just from our paper, but from everyone in the field that's leading this work, is that it's sort of a fine tuning of circuits. We know that pregnancy is the lead up to this time in your life where there's a lot of behavioral adaptation that has to occur and a new cognitive demands and a new cognitive load. And so the idea here is that there is this pruning or this delicate rewiring to make certain networks or to make communication in the brain more efficient to meet the demands that are going to have to occur. And interestingly, we see the exact same pattern in other periods of brain development, like adolescence, right? Adolescence is marked by this, onset of hormones in puberty. We see this fine-tuning, gray matter volume reduction, increased white matter and white matter microstructure, a suite of adaptations that have to occur, cognitive, mood, behavior changes. But it's specifically, I think, with pregnancy, because there is a lot of subjective and sometimes objective changes in cognition. We really tie those changes to like, oh yeah, they're harmful. But in fact, when we zoom out and we look at the lifespan, it actually can be beneficial that this is happening. And this is very normal. So don't have to think of it in the sense that there's reduction, so my brain is shrinking and I can't function. And in fact, it's good that this is happening.
Pregnancy brain, and I don't know if that's considered a pejorative term. If it is, I apologize to anybody who, but being more forgetful, things like that. Does that translate to being a better mom? I mean, like, how do you correlate those two things?
That's an interesting way to phrase it. And, I do think people are trying to rebrand mommy brain or pregnancy brain, albeit that's what the common, terms are. So that is interesting because for a couple of reasons. One is the first sort of pinnacle papers that came out looking at neuroanatomy in human women from preconception to postpartum found that degree of change in gray matter volume, that sort of reduction, correlated with various maternal care or maternal behavior. Again, that's all correlation.
But what does that mean? Like what though? Because again, your memory centers are sort of in, your hippocampus, sort of these certain areas of the brain. With cortical thinning, what did that translate to in terms of what the women were experiencing?
Yeah. So what they found was that reductions in gray matter volume, especially in regions that overlap with theory of mind or the default mode network, areas that are important in caregiving and all of that, and emotional processing, higher order cognition. If areas that changed the greatest, so they had the greatest decline in gray matter volume, which again can be a fine tuning, showed positive associations with bonding with their infant, and they also showed that sort of there was less hostility to their infant. Again, that's an area we need to do a lot more research on, and it needs a lot of context, because anytime you're about to say like, the more forgetful you are, or your brain changing, maybe that's out of your control, is going to predict how good of a mom you are. It's like I don't think we can actually answer that at all. But it is, the overarching question is like, how can we tangibly contextualize that gray matter change? But you can expect that if there's fine tuning in these circuits that underlie sort of cognitive or behavioral process, that the more fine tuning it goes, the better performance you're going to have. That's the idea, but it's so much more complicated than that. But yeah, that there are people who are looking at, the degree of cognitive change in relation to how their postpartum experiences are. Now, those that are, we know this from any other period of life, those that are struggling the most, that maybe have the greatest degree of cognitive complaints or feel those cognitive change, could be those people that are the most vulnerable to a lot of things that occur in postpartum too, including mood disorders or sleep dysregulation, and don't have that support. And all of that compounds your relationship to your offspring. And that's why we need to have as much support in the postpartum as possible. But it's still an area that we need to work on. The studies are small and it's all correlational at this point.
So just for the audience, because we're using a lot of neuroscience terms here, talking about cortical thickening and default mode networks and the changes obviously in the brain as a result of pregnancy. What do you think the message is there for people?
Mm-hmm. I think where I always start is that this is a critical period of brain development, and there's going to be this period of neuroplasticity, our ability to adapt to physiological and environmental demands, where we can sort of ease up on the inhibition and change things as necessary. And that's normal. And that's really cool. And just as you would expect every other part of your body to change, so is pregnancy. And it's not necessarily it's not a bad thing, but it's a window of opportunity to maybe fine tune certain circuits. It's also a window of vulnerability. Anytime your brain is in flux or you're in a transition stage, there's going to be vulnerability to, say, mood disorders or neurological related conditions that we can get into as well. But it's just almost a way to provide quantitative evidence for all of the things that women have been feeling for time and time again, that there's this choreographed dance that's occurring between your gray and your white matter over this gestational period, ultimately to prepare you or to be able to adapt to all of the demands that are happening now or happening in the future. And that's actually a really powerful thing.
This should be reassuring, it sounds like, to some extent.
Yeah, I think so. And from the people I've spoken to, it's helped them understand a little bit more of why things are happening. And I think anytime you provide evidence that this is occurring, and it can fit within them saying, yeah, if you talk to any person who's gone through pregnancy or parenthood, they're going to say, yeah, like my brain feels different now. Like my auditory cortex has to have changed because I hear things differently now. And so to be able to say like, and look, that's that region over this gestational period changing is, I think, reassuring and kind of hopefully interesting. And if we show that and tie it to this message of this is adaptation and it's not this sort of shrinking, it's not related to like, you're not hitting your head and you're losing brain cells or anything, but rather like this shift, this metamorphosis, this etching, however we want to package it, it's a really powerful and cool thing that's happening for a reason, and to mostly everyone.
And that reason fundamentally, I mean, and again, I am very careful as a fellow neuroscientist not to oversimplify, but the reason that these brain changes happen, could you make the case that it's to better prepare you, equip you to care for this child?
That's a leading theory for sure. And I think you have to ask the question of like any time that your brain is going to undergo change like this, it takes a lot of energy and it's resource heavy. And so why would we be doing that if it wasn't for some sort of reason? And pregnancy itself is, a essential facet of reproductive life. That's how it's happening ubiquitously across women. And, 85% of women are going to experience this.
But it does raise this question as well about whether you did, I don't know how old the woman was that you originally did the study on, but would it make a difference for women who are older when they have their children?
Yes, there's so many interesting questions to ask. So, this was just almost a proof of concept study to say we haven't been doing this, and there are a variety of reasons why. But we need to ask this, and here are a ton of low-hanging fruit. So one is the age component. So our subject was 37, and if you hear, I always like to start my lectures or talks with what comes to mind when you hear brain development. And it's always like, oh, it's, in utero or infant or adolescent brains. And it really is like the first couple decades of life. And then I always hear that like 25, your brain is done developing.
That's right.
And then I showcase this data and I'm like, this is a 37-year-old female who look at her trajectories of the brain compared to adolescents. But it opens up. And the reason I'm saying that is because another huge question then is, okay, what if you undergo pregnancy at 20 or 18? When there are other sorts of periods of brain development occurring, or 40 or 45. How does that influence your menopause trajectory? How does that influence brain health later on? We don't know. We also have no real idea of what these changes look like in a second or a third pregnancy.
Right. If
that second pregnancy happens 1 year later or 5 years later, low-hanging fruit that we just have not mapped.
It's fascinating. So that person you followed through pregnancy was 37 years old. Mm-hmm. Everyone is different. And you mentioned this at the top, Laura, but how you want to reproduce these findings? Obviously, that's the nature of science. But so what can we say at this point? How valid do you think the study is in terms of what this means for brain changes in pregnancy overall?
Yes. So I feel very confident in having spoken to all of my colleagues and all of the pioneers in this field that one of the most consistent findings in neuroscience is this sort of persistent reduction and that
persistent reduction in gray matter
volume,
cortical thickness.
Exactly.
Okay.
We see this in because other people have, looked at this and measured this, maybe not in the way we did, but these sort of snapshot or, 1 or 2 times during pregnancy now is coming online. And it's just consistent. It's like 90% and above of participants are showing this. We have prelim data from the people who've followed up and done this exact protocol that show nearly the same patterns. And we have all of the translational research too. One, that that pregnancy is a period of brain plasticity and it's a critical window for brain change. And 2, that you're going to see this persistent reduction in gray matter volume, cortical thickness. The white matter microstructure finding that we saw is actually quite interesting because we saw this sort of nonlinear rise, and it's the measure of diffusion along that myelin that's protecting the axon. You could think of it, for anyone listening, as like the integrity of that white matter tract to help signal processing as like a weak celery stalk or a really fresh celery stalk or things like that. We saw this sort of nonlinear rise. It peaked in second trimester and kind of went down to third trimester and then back to baseline, which kind of fits with anyone who's done the snapshot approach of pre and post pregnancy, seeing no changes in that measure. But I would say that I feel very confident that this is a finding we're going to see. I think there's a lot of signal because, your hormones, which can act as neuromodulators, are rising by 100 to 1,000 fold in your body, which is the highest it's ever going to be. And it really, I think, is hormonally mediated neuroplasticity. So very confident that these changes hold up.
And as you said, I guess in some ways this is revelatory what you found, but not surprising at the same time.
Yes, exactly. And it was, really fun to sit with that data and be playing with it and trying to break it. And I took it to all these different labs, including someone at the National Institute of Health. And I was like, what? This is just so beautiful. Like it can't be this linear. It can't be this fitting within this literature. Because as you know, that science is so messy. It just was fun to see kind of because you're sitting on data that no one has, at least to our knowledge, published on yet. Of 26 time points during that perinatal period of
really
a person.
Fascinating. Yeah.
And it was
it's a pretty laborious study. I mean, congrats to the study subjects, right? You have not been pregnant yet. If you do become pregnant in your life, based on your own research, would you do anything differently? Is there a message in there for women who might be listening, who are thinking about pregnancy?
I think that I've been asked this a few times and I've thought about it a little bit more. And I think for me, I would feel so much calmer, and I do feel calmer going into that life stage, knowing that certain things are normal. And I think of it as sort of a reference range. That's what I'm trying to build actually right now, is if you go get a blood test and you have, say, sort of elevated iron, but it's within the normal range, it doesn't get flagged. That's sort of what I want to do for brain changes during pregnancy, because that can calm me into saying, I know the literature. I know that I'm going to have sort of maybe these memory or attention subjective feelings of that changing. And okay, that's fine. Here, I'm going to talk to my physician. I'm going to talk to my partner and say, if you're seeing that it's impacting my quality of life, and I'm have, maybe more severe version of that, maybe I'll do my own sort of cognitive exams on myself. Why stop? Then I would ask, I would want to talk to a doctor about that and try to seek maybe help there. But knowing what's normal or what to expect and just having more knowledge of what this is going to be is really helpful to me. Additionally, knowing how vulnerable that first 4 weeks are in the postpartum, because I've seen hormones, I've seen how they drop very steeply in that period. And along with this, knowing that this is one of the most heightened times in a woman's life for mood disorders, and it's very prevalent, that I can go into that period knowing I need as much support as possible. And here's who I'm going to ask, or I'm going to ask my partner to make sure that they're monitoring myself. Because, you take your baby in and it has all these pediatric visits, and you don't have these sort of mental health checks for the moms. You don't have as much care for the postpartum mom as I think we should in our healthcare system. And so, I think women should definitely be aware of that and talk to their partner and the people around them to help them. And on the science side, we can try to make those reference frames and make the guidelines and try to improve the prediction and the treatment options for pregnant women of who's going to go on to have the most severe decompensation.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that last part, you starting to be predictive. On one hand, I do find it, just trying to understand all this, would think that it would be reassuring for people. I think understanding that there are changes that happen in the brain, it's something that is common. It's related to pregnancy in this case that you're talking about. I think that's in some ways reassuring for folks. So thank you for sharing all that with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.